where the secrets of the heart are written with ink and sealed with scandal. Welcome to channel, The Countess Chronicles.
You know what nobody tells you about being destroyed by society? It's not the initial blow that breaks you. It's the silence that follows. The silence from the one person who could have saved you with just a few words, but chose to say nothing while you burned. Now, here's the controversial truth that'll make some people uncomfortable. We live in a world that still punishes women for daring to feel, for daring to want, for daring to exist, outside the impossibly narrow boxes society builds for them. And the wild part? This isn't just some dusty historical problem. It's happening right now, every single day, wrapped in different packaging but driven by the same ancient codes of control and judgment. The secret nobody wants to admit is that one moment of vulnerability, one authentic connection, one real emotion can still be twisted into a weapon against you if the wrong people decide you've stepped out of line. Let me hit you with something that's going to sound like a paradox, but stick with me here. The stories we think are about the past, they're actually blueprints for understanding the present. Georgiana's tale ain't some romantic fiction meant to entertain you for a few minutes. It's a mirror reflecting every time you've been judged unfairly, every time you've been blamed for something that wasn't entirely your fault, every time someone powerful stayed silent while you were crucified. Here's the controversial part that'll ruffle some feathers. We still live in a society where your reputation can be destroyed in hours, where social media mobs can tear you apart based on rumors and half-truths, where the people with power and privilege watch from the sidelines while vulnerable people get sacrificed. Sound familiar? It should, because the technology changed, but the human behavior didn't. The mystery isn't why these patterns keep repeating. It's why we keep pretending they don't exist. But here's where this gets really interesting, where the quick reward comes in for sticking with me. What if I told you that 8 words, just 8 carefully chosen words spoken at the right moment by the right person, can completely dismantle weeks of destruction? What if the solution to systemic cruelty isn't complicated philosophical frameworks or gradual social evolution, but rather people with privilege finally choosing to use their power to protect instead of preserve the status quo? This story you're about to hear isn't just entertainment. It's a manual for understanding how real change happens when someone decides that another person's dignity matters more than their own comfort. The trace of hope in this tale isn't that justice naturally prevails. It's that sometimes, when someone finally speaks truth to power, the entire foundation of lies comes crashing down. Now I know what you're thinking. Another story about a woman needing a man to save her? Really? But hold up, because that's not what this is about. And if you think that's the lesson here, you're missing the whole point. This is about power dynamics, about how silence from those who could speak up is often more damaging than the attacks themselves, about how complicity from the privileged enables systematic destruction of the vulnerable. Georgiana's story is about the conflict between who society says you are and who you actually are, about the hidden mechanisms that keep certain people crushed while others float above consequences. And here's the strong belief I'm going to share with you. The most dangerous thing in any society isn't the obvious villains. It's the good people who stay silent, who watch injustice unfold and do nothing because speaking up might cost them something. Here's the counterintuitive statement that's going to challenge everything you think you know about redemption and justice. Georgiana didn't earn her way back into society's good graces by proving her worth or demonstrating her innocence. She was redeemed because someone with power finally decided she was worth defending. Not because she changed, but because the narrative around her changed. And that should make you uncomfortable, because it means justice often depends less on truth and more on who's willing to fight for it. The revelation in this story isn't that love conquers all. It's that privilege, when used intentionally and courageously, can redistribute power in ways that isolated individuals never could. That's the uncomfortable truth we need to sit with. Sometimes the solution to injustice isn't the victim proving themselves worthy. It's allies with advantages actually showing up when it matters. So let me ask you something that'll hit close to home. Have you ever been misunderstood, judged, or condemned by people who didn't know the full story? Have you ever watched someone with more power than you stay silent while you were attacked? Have you ever felt like the world decided who you were without giving you a chance to speak for yourself? If you answered yes to any of those questions, and let's be honest, who hasn't? Then Georgiana's story is your story too. This ain't about dukes and ballrooms and historical romance. It's about the universal human experience of being vulnerable, being judged, and wondering if anyone will ever stand up for you when you can't stand up for yourself. The enigma we're about to unravel isn't just what happened to one woman in one moment. It's why these patterns persist, and what it actually takes to break them. Here's your quick reward for paying attention. By the time we're done with this story, you're gonna understand exactly why 8 specific words carried more power than weeks of rumors, how to recognize when silence is complicity, and what it actually looks like when someone uses their privilege for good instead of self-preservation. You'll learn why performative allyship fails while genuine advocacy succeeds, how public accountability works differently than private apologies, and why, the moment someone powerful finally speaks truth, can shift entire social dynamics instantly. This ain't theoretical knowledge you'll forget tomorrow. This is practical wisdom you can apply to your own life, your own relationships, your own understanding of how power works in every space you occupy. The codes we're about to decode have been operating in the shadows for centuries. But once you see them clearly, you can never unsee them. And here's the final hook that's gonna keep you engaged. This story has a twist that nobody saw coming. A moment where everything you think you understand about power and redemption gets flipped on its head. The Duke's 8 words weren't just a defense, they were a calculated dismantling of the entire system that had destroyed Georgiana. But we gotta walk through the pain first, through the humiliation and the silence and the despair, because that's where the real lessons live. That's where you'll recognize yourself, your experiences, your own battles with judgment and injustice. The disappearance of Georgiana's social standing, the conspiracy of whispers that tried to erase her, the forbidden connection that sparked everything. All of it builds toward a revelation that'll change how you think about courage, responsibility, and what it means to truly stand beside someone when the world's against them. So buckle up, because we're about to dive deep into a story that's going to make you feel, think, and maybe even see yourself in ways you didn't expect. You know, there's something about ballroom nights that carries this strange mix of elegance and danger, like walking on a tightrope covered in silk. Georgiana wasn't searching for love that evening. She wasn't even thinking about it. The Duke of Ashford? Well, he was the kind of man every woman whispered about, the kind whose presence alone could shift the entire energy of a room. Powerful, wealthy, untouchable, and completely out of reach for someone like her. But life's got this funny way of throwing curveballs when you least expect them, doesn't it? That night, something shifted in the universe, and neither of them saw it coming. It's like when you're minding your own business, and suddenly everything changes with one glance, one moment, one breath. Now, let me paint you the real picture here, because it wasn't some fairy tale scene with moonlight and rose petals. Georgiana was hiding in a dark corridor, away from judgmental stares and shallow conversations that felt like daggers. She was crying, letting those tears fall without caring who might see, because sometimes you just reach that breaking point, you know? Then he appeared, like a shadow materializing from nowhere, and instead of asking what was wrong or offering some generic comfort, he simply wiped her tears away. That gesture, that single wordless action, spoke volumes about the kind of man he was beneath all that power and prestige. It's the kind of thing that bypasses your brain and goes straight to your heart, leaving this enigma of emotions you can't quite name. Here's what most people don't get about vulnerability, and this is crucial. When you're broken down and someone doesn't try to fix you, doesn't tell you to be strong or pull yourself together, but instead sits in that darkness with you, that's when real connection happens. Think about it like this. Imagine you're on the floor, completely shattered, and instead of someone reaching down to pull you up, they sit right there beside you in the mess. That's what he did for Georgiana. No questions asked, no judgment passed. Two broken souls recognizing each other's pain without needing words to explain it. And that kiss? Oh, that kiss didn't happen because of passion or desire in the traditional sense. It happened because sometimes when two fractured people meet, they don't heal each other. They just share the weight of their wounds, and for one fleeting second, that burden becomes lighter. The thing about stolen moments is they never stay hidden for long, especially in a world built on gossip and appearances. Someone saw them, lurking in the shadows like a vulture waiting for carrion, and in societies like theirs, where reputation was currency and scandal was bankruptcy, a forbidden kiss wasn't romance, it was ruin. It was the kind of trace that could destroy a woman's entire existence while barely scratching the surface of a man's reputation. Georgiana didn't know it yet, but that single moment of human connection, that brief escape from loneliness, would become the catalyst for her complete social disappearance. The codes of high society were clear. Women who stepped out of line, who dared to feel, who dared to exist outside the narrow boxes assigned to them, had to be punished. Let me share something with you that'll make this hit different. Society's always been obsessed with controlling women's emotions and desires, hasn't it? Even today, we see it play out in different forms. Back then, if a woman was seen in any compromising situation, she was automatically the seductress, the manipulator, the one who should have known better. The man? Well, he was just a victim of feminine wiles, poor thing. This double standard wasn't just unfair, it was systematically designed to keep women in a state of constant fear and self-policing. Georgiana's tears that night, her vulnerability, her human need for comfort, all of it was about to be twisted into a narrative she never wrote. The hidden truth of what really happened would matter less than the story society chose to believe. Now, here's where you gotta pay attention, because this is where the real conflict begins to brew beneath the surface. That kiss represented more than just two people sharing a moment. It represented a challenge to the entire social order. When word started spreading, and trust me, it spread faster than wildfire through dry grass, Georgiana's name became synonymous with scandal. She didn't know it yet, but she'd just been marked, branded with an invisible scarlet letter that everyone could see. The whispers started immediately, like a conspiracy forming in real time, each person adding their own twist to the story. Did you hear about Georgiana? I always knew there was something off about her. Imagine throwing yourself at a duke like that. None of it was true, but truth rarely matters when scandal's involved, does it? What breaks my heart about this, and what you need to really understand, is how quickly everything unraveled for her. One moment, She was just another young woman trying to navigate society's impossible expectations. The next, she was marked as lost, ruined, unsalvageable. The ball continued inside, music playing, people laughing, completely unaware that someone's life was about to be systematically destroyed. Georgiana walked home that night, probably still feeling the ghost of his touch, not knowing that by morning, her entire world would be set ablaze. The secret of their moment together was already escaping into the night air, carried by eager mouths ready to tear her apart. And the Duke? He returned to his life of privilege, not yet realizing that his silence in the coming days would hurt her more than any accusation ever could. And this is where the story starts to really hurt, where it digs its claws into your chest and doesn't let go. Because what happened next wasn't just about social rejection or gossip, it was about systematic destruction. The machinery of high society, with all its unwritten rules and ruthless enforcement, was about to grind Georgiana into dust. Everything she'd worked for, every relationship she'd built, every dream she'd harbored, all of it was about to crumble. The mystery of why he stayed silent, why he didn't defend her, why he let the world believe she'd seduced him, that would haunt her for weeks to come. But we'll get to that, because the real revelation of his character and hers was still waiting in the shadows, ready to emerge when the pain reached its peak. By the time the sun rose the next morning, all of London knew. It's crazy how fast information travels when it's drenched in scandal, isn't it? The newspapers had already printed their vicious little columns. The gossip mongers had already gathered in their parlors over tea, and the matrons of society had already passed their judgment. Everyone was talking about her, about Georgiana, the woman who dared to reach above her station. How did she have the audacity? A woman without title trying to seduce a duke. She must have trapped him, deceived him somehow. The narrative was written before she even woke up, before she even knew her life had been turned into public entertainment. Nobody asked if he kissed her first. Nobody questioned if it was mutual. Nobody cared about the truth. The blame always falls on the woman, doesn't it? Always has, probably always will, unless we fight like hell to change it. Here's what gets me about this whole thing. And you gotta really feel this. Georgiana hadn't done anything different from what countless men did every single day without consequence. She'd shared a moment of vulnerability, a moment of human connection, a kiss. That's it. But because she was a woman, because she existed in a body that society felt entitled to control and judge, that single kiss became her defining characteristic. It's like when one of your friends goes through a breakup today and everyone immediately assumes she did something wrong, you know? Or when a woman gets involved with someone important and suddenly she's labeled a gold digger, an opportunist, someone with ulterior motives. We still live in a world that does this. We still see it play out on social media, in workplaces, in families. So imagine what it was like 200 years ago when women had even less power, even fewer rights, even smaller voices that could be silenced with just a whisper campaign. The invitations stopped coming first. That was the initial trace of her social disappearance. One by one, the events she'd been expected to attend suddenly had limited space, or were family only, or just conveniently forgot to include her name on the guest list. Her friends, women she'd laughed with and confided in, women she'd considered sisters, they turned their faces away when she passed by on the street. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine the people you trusted most suddenly acting like you're invisible, like you're contaminated with some disease they might catch if they acknowledge your existence? It's the kind of rejection that cuts deeper than any insult ever could. And her own family? Oh, they were ashamed, embarrassed that their daughter had brought such scandal upon their name. They looked at her with disappointment and disgust, like she'd committed some unforgivable sin rather than simply being human. And the Duke? The man whose silence could have stopped all of this with just a few words? He remained quiet as a tomb. He didn't defend her, didn't offer explanations, didn't use his considerable power and influence to protect her from the wolves tearing her reputation to shreds. Just silence. Cold, calculated, deafening silence. Now, you might be wondering why that silence hurt so much, why it mattered more than all the accusations and gossip combined. Let me tell you something about betrayal. The deepest cuts don't come from enemies. They come from the people who were supposed to stand beside you. It's like screaming in an empty room where you know someone's listening but nobody responds. You can handle strangers judging you. You can even handle friends falling away. But when the person who was there in your most vulnerable moment abandons you, that's a different kind of pain entirely. Here's a real-world example that might help you understand the depth of this betrayal. Imagine you're at work and you get publicly criticized for something you and your colleague did together. But your colleague has more seniority, more respect, more power. Instead of sharing the responsibility, instead of standing up and saying, "We both made this decision," they just let you take the fall alone. They watch as your career burns while theirs remains untouched. That's what was happening to Georgiana, except multiply it by 1,000 because her entire existence, not just her career, was on the line. The codes of society were clear. His silence was permission for everyone else to destroy her. His refusal to speak up was essentially handing the executioners their weapons and saying, "Have at it." And the mystery of why he chose this path, why he protected himself instead of her, that became another weight she carried. Georgiana started believing what they said about her. And this is where it gets really dangerous, really heartbreaking. When you hear something often enough, when everyone around you confirms the same narrative, your brain starts accepting it as truth, even when you know deep down it's a lie. She started feeling small, unworthy, wrong, like maybe she had seduced him, like maybe she was the manipulative temptress they all claimed she was. It's like psychological warfare, this constant barrage of judgment and shame, chipping away at your sense of self until you don't even recognize who you are anymore. She'd look in the mirror and see what they saw. A woman who'd overstepped, who'd reached for something she had no right to want, who deserved every bit of punishment she was receiving. The hidden truth of her innocence, of their mutual connection, got buried beneath layers of internalized shame and self-doubt. You know what's worse than being judged by others? It's when you start judging yourself through their eyes, when their voices become the voice in your head. Georgiana would replay that night over and over, analyzing every moment, every gesture, every word, wondering if maybe she had done something wrong, if maybe she had led him on somehow, if maybe she deserved this fate. The conflict wasn't just external anymore, it had become internal, a war raging inside her own mind. She isolated herself, stopped going out, stopped trying to defend herself because what was the point? The trial had already happened. The verdict had already been delivered, and she'd been found guilty without ever getting to speak in her own defense. The secret she carried, the truth of what really happened in that corridor, felt less important than the story everyone else had already accepted as fact. And here's what you need to understand as we move forward. This wasn't just about one woman's scandal. This was about maintaining a system of control. Georgiana's public destruction served as a warning to every other woman watching. Stay in your lane. Know your place. Don't reach for more than society deems appropriate for you. Her humiliation was meant to be educational, a lesson in what happens when you break the rules, even accidentally. But what nobody anticipated, what no one saw coming, was that this story wasn't over yet. Because sometimes, when you're buried deepest in the dirt, when you've got nothing left to lose, when you've already been declared lost and ruined, that's when the real revelation begins. And Georgiana's story? It was about to take a turn nobody expected, least of all her. Weeks passed like torture, each day bringing a new wave of whispers and sideways glances that cut deeper than any blade ever could. Then came the invitation, or rather, the forced obligation that Georgiana's family insisted she couldn't refuse. A charity event, they said. One of those gatherings where high society pretended to care about the poor while really just showing off their wealth and connections. Her family demanded she attend, convinced that hiding would only make things worse. "You need to show them you have nothing to be ashamed of," her mother told her, as if shame was something you could simply choose not to feel. As if walking into a room full of people who'd spent weeks tearing you apart was just another social obligation, like attending a tea party or a garden stroll. But Georgiana knew better. She knew exactly what awaited her, and every fiber of her being screamed to stay home, to remain hidden, to protect what little dignity she had left. The moment she stepped through those grand doors into the ballroom, the silence that fell was absolutely deafening. It wasn't the comfortable quiet of people minding their own business. It was the loaded silence of predators spotting prey. Every single conversation stopped mid-sentence. Every head turned in her direction. Every eye locked onto her like she'd just committed a crime by simply existing in their space. You ever walk into a room and immediately feel like you don't belong? Like everyone knows something about you that you wish they didn't? Multiply that feeling by 1,000, and you'll get close to what Georgiana experienced. The weight of all those stares pressed down on her chest, making it hard to breathe, hard to think, hard to remember why she'd thought she could survive this. The enigma of human cruelty is that people can be so civilized, so polished on the surface, while simultaneously wielding their judgment like weapons designed for maximum damage. Then the whispers started. And here's the thing about whispers. They're designed to be heard by their target while maintaining plausible deniability. They weren't even trying to be subtle about it. There she is. The audacity to show her face here. After what she did, she still has the nerve to appear in public? Absolutely shameless, that one. Each comment was like a physical blow, carefully calibrated to wound without leaving visible marks. Georgiana stood there frozen, caught in this nightmare where she was surrounded by hundreds of people, yet completely, devastatingly alone. She could feel her hands shaking, could feel her throat tightening, could feel every instinct in her body screaming at her to run, to escape, to disappear into thin air. The trace of her former social standing had completely evaporated, replaced by this new identity as the woman everyone loved to hate. The cautionary tale mothers would tell their daughters about what happens when you forget your place. Let me ask you something that'll make this hit closer to home. Have you ever felt exposed in a way that made you want to crawl out of your own skin? Like that time you showed up to school with toilet paper stuck to your shoe, or when you realized everyone heard that embarrassing thing you said, or when a private moment got shared publicly without your consent. Now imagine that feeling, but it's not about something small or temporary. It's about your entire character being questioned, your entire worth as a human being reduced to one moment that got twisted beyond recognition. That's what Georgiana felt standing in that ballroom. She wasn't just embarrassed. She was stripped bare, vulnerable, judged, and completely defenseless. The hidden truth of what really happened didn't matter anymore, because everyone had already decided who she was and what she deserved, and nothing she could say would change their minds. The analogy that comes to mind is standing naked in the middle of a crowd where everyone else is fully dressed, protected, armored. You're exposed to every criticism, every harsh judgment, every cruel assessment, while they get to hide behind their fancy clothes and social status. Georgiana was that naked person, metaphorically speaking, with nowhere to hide and no way to defend herself against the onslaught. Part of her, and this is the part that breaks my heart, actually believed they were right. She'd internalized so much of their hatred that she started thinking maybe she did deserve this public execution. Maybe she was shameless. Maybe she was wrong. Maybe she should have known better than to feel anything real in a world built on pretense and performance. The conflict between who she knew herself to be and who they claimed she was had reached a breaking point, and she was losing the battle. Here's what most people don't understand about public humiliation. It's not just about that one moment. It's about every moment that follows, where you carry that shame like a weight chained to your ankle. Georgiana wanted nothing more than for the earth to open up and swallow her whole, to simply cease existing rather than endure another second of this torture. She'd already turned to leave, already decided that survival meant retreat, that living to fight another day meant getting the hell out of that ballroom before she completely shattered. Her hand was on the door, her escape route planned, her dignity hanging by the thinnest thread imaginable. The secret she carried, the memory of genuine connection she'd shared with the Duke, felt like a distant dream, something that couldn't possibly be real given how thoroughly she'd been punished for it. But then, something happened. Something that would shift the entire trajectory of this story. Just as Georgiana was about to push through those doors and disappear forever from high society, just as she was about to let them win, let them reduce her to nothing, a sound cut through the whispers. The grand entrance doors opened with a force that demanded attention, and every head in that ballroom turned once again. Because sometimes, just when you think you're completely lost, when you've accepted your fate as the villain in everyone else's story, the universe throws you a lifeline you never saw coming. Sometimes, rescue arrives at the exact moment you've stopped believing in it. And for Georgiana, standing there on the precipice of complete social disappearance, salvation was about to walk through those doors in the form of the one person who could change everything with his presence alone. The mystery of why he'd stayed silent for weeks was about to be answered, though not in the way anyone expected. The revelation that was coming would shock every single person in that room, would force them to confront their own cruelty and judgment, would redistribute power in a way that defied every code society had established. But we're not there yet. We're still in this moment where Georgiana's at her lowest, where she's internalized all their hatred, where she's ready to accept exile as her permanent state. Hold that feeling. Sit with it for a second, because the contrast between this moment and what's about to happen is what makes this story so powerful, so transformative, so absolutely necessary for you to understand about how real change happens when someone finally uses their privilege to protect rather than preserve the status quo. The doors swung open with such force that the sound echoed through the entire ballroom like thunder before a storm. And there he stood, the Duke of Ashford himself, the man whose silence had allowed Georgiana to be destroyed, the man everyone respected and feared in equal measure. He rarely attended these charity events, considering them beneath his station, so his presence alone was enough to send shockwaves through the crowd. Every conversation that had been dissecting Georgiana's character immediately ceased. Every whisper died on people's lips. Because when a man of his power enters a room, everything else becomes secondary. The enigma of his sudden appearance hung heavy in the air. Why was he here? What did this mean? The secret intentions behind his arrival became the only thing anyone cared about, temporarily lifting the spotlight off Georgiana, giving her a moment to breathe while everyone's attention shifted to him. But then something happened that made Georgiana's blood run cold. He didn't stop to greet the hosts, didn't pause to acknowledge the other nobility vying for his attention, didn't do any of the social niceties expected of someone of his rank. Instead, he started walking, his eyes locked on a target across the room. Each step he took echoed in that cavernous space, measured and deliberate, like a judge approaching the bench to deliver a verdict. And the direction he was heading? Straight toward Georgiana, the woman everyone had been crucifying just moments before. The woman he'd abandoned to the wolves with his weeks of silence. Every eye in that ballroom began alternating between him and her, watching this collision course unfold, anticipating what would surely be the final nail in her coffin. Was he gonna confront her publicly? Confirm all the rumors? Finish destroying what little remained of her reputation? The tension in that room was thick enough to cut with a knife, I'm telling you. It's like those moments before a verdict is read in a courtroom, where time seems to slow down and every possible outcome runs through your mind simultaneously. Georgiana couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't do anything but stand there frozen as this man who'd haunted her thoughts for weeks bore down on her with single-minded purpose. The trace of hope she'd carried, that maybe their connection had meant something, had long since died, replaced by the bitter acceptance that she'd been nothing more than a momentary lapse in judgment for him. Part of her wanted to run, to spare herself whatever public humiliation he was about to deliver. But her legs wouldn't cooperate. She was trapped, not by walls or doors, but by the weight of hundreds of judgmental stares and the paralyzing fear of what was coming next. Here's what you got to understand about power dynamics, and this is crucial. In that moment, Georgiana's entire future rested in the hands of a man who'd already shown through his silence that he valued his own reputation over her well-being. She had zero control, zero agency, zero ability to defend herself or shape the narrative. It's like standing before a judge who's already demonstrated bias against you, waiting for a sentence you know won't be fair. Think about times in your own life when your fate depended entirely on someone else's decision, when you couldn't argue or explain or defend yourself, when you just had to stand there and accept whatever came. Maybe it was a job interview where you needed the position desperately, or a relationship conversation where the other person held all the cards, or a family moment where someone else's approval meant everything. That powerlessness, that complete vulnerability, that's what Georgiana experienced magnified by 1,000. The Duke stopped directly in front of her, close enough that she could see the details of his face, the intensity in his eyes, the set of his jaw. The entire ballroom held its collective breath, everyone leaning forward slightly, not wanting to miss a single word of this confrontation. Some people probably expected him to denounce her, to publicly state that she'd thrown herself at him, to protect his own reputation by sacrificing hers even further. Others maybe hoped for drama, for tears, for a spectacle they could gossip about for months to come. Nobody, and I mean nobody, expected what actually happened next. The mystery of what he'd been thinking during those weeks of silence was about to be revealed, and the revelation would shatter every assumption, every rumor, every carefully constructed lie that society had built around this scandal. He looked into Georgiana's eyes first, and something passed between them in that moment, something unspoken but profound. Then he turned his gaze to sweep across the entire assembly, making sure everyone was paying attention, making sure his words would be heard by every single person who'd participated in Georgiana's destruction. The codes of high society were about to be challenged in a way they'd never been before, by someone who actually had the power to rewrite them. And when he opened his mouth to speak, his voice carried across that silent ballroom with absolute clarity and unmistakable authority. 8 words, just 8 simple words that would change absolutely everything. She didn't seduce me. I chose to love her. The impact of those words hit like a physical force, ripples of shock spreading through the crowd as people tried to process what they'd just heard. Total silence followed, the kind of silence that feels almost sacred, like the moment after lightning strikes but before the thunder rolls. Nobody moved, nobody breathed, nobody dared make a sound because the weight of what he'd just said was still settling over the room like snow covering everything in pristine white. He hadn't just defended her, he'd redistributed blame, he'd claimed agency, he'd used the word love in front of everyone who mattered. In a world where men were supposedly seduced by cunning women, where female sexuality was feared and controlled, where women were always the ones at fault, he'd just said, "No, this was my choice, my decision, my love." The hidden truth had finally been spoken aloud, and it carried the weight of absolute authority because it came from him, from the man whose word was law in these circles. The conflict that had defined Georgiana's existence for weeks had just been reframed entirely, and nobody knew quite how to respond. And here's where we see the real power of words used at the right moment by the right person. Those 8 words didn't just defend Georgiana, they indicted everyone who'd judged her. They forced every person in that room to confront their own cruelty, their own willingness to destroy someone based on assumptions and gossip rather than truth. It's like when someone finally speaks up about an injustice everyone's been ignoring, and suddenly you can't pretend you didn't know. You can't hide behind plausible deniability anymore. The Duke had just held up a mirror to high society and forced them to see their own ugliness reflected back. But words alone wouldn't be enough. Actions would have to follow to cement this dramatic shift in power and perception. And what he did next would prove whether those 8 words were genuine or just another performance in a world built on pretense. Let's break down exactly what happened in those 8 words, because surface-level understanding ain't gonna cut it here. She didn't seduce me. Right there, in that first part, he stripped away the entire foundation of society's narrative against Georgiana. He didn't say, "It was a misunderstanding," or "Things got out of hand." He specifically negated the accusation that had been destroying her for weeks. He took the blame off her shoulders publicly, in front of every single person who'd been spreading rumors and casting judgment. Then came, "I chose." Those 2 words are absolutely critical because they represent agency, intention, deliberate decision-making. He wasn't claiming he'd been swept away by passion or tricked by feminine wiles. He was saying this was a conscious choice he made with full awareness. And finally, to love her, not kiss her, not be with her, not some vague physical description, but love. Love ain't scandalous. Love ain't something to be ashamed of. Love is noble and pure and exactly the kind of thing high society claimed to value above all else. Now, here's where this gets really powerful, where you gotta sit with the depth of what he accomplished. He didn't just defend Georgiana, he completely redistributed the power dynamic that had been crushing her. In a world where women were constantly painted as temptresses, leading innocent men astray, where Eve was blamed for Adam's choice, where female sexuality was something dangerous that needed to be controlled and punished, he said, "No, I had agency, I made a choice. This was mine to own." It's revolutionary when you really think about it. He could have stayed silent, could have let her continue bearing the weight of society's judgment while he remained untouched in his ivory tower of privilege. But instead, he used that very privilege as a shield for her, saying essentially, if you want to judge this situation, you're going to have to judge me too, and we all know you won't dare. The secret to real allyship, real solidarity, ain't just expressing support privately. It's using whatever power you have publicly to protect those who have none. Think about this in modern terms for a second, because the parallel is going to make this crystal clear. How many times have you seen someone get torn apart on social media, their reputation destroyed by rumors and half-truths, while the other person involved just stays quiet and lets it happen? How many times have you watched someone with power and privilege stand by silently while someone with less power gets crucified for something they both participated in? It happens constantly, right? In workplaces, in relationships, in communities, in every corner of society. The person with more to lose stays protected, while the vulnerable one gets sacrificed. What the Duke did was the opposite of that pattern. He broke the code of self-preservation that powerful people usually follow. He essentially said, you know what? My reputation, my standing, my comfort, all of that matters less than speaking the truth and protecting someone who can't protect herself. That's rare, that's powerful, and that's exactly what was needed in that moment. But let's dig even deeper into why these specific words carried so much weight, because there's layers here you might have missed. When he said, "She didn't seduce me," he was directly contradicting the narrative that women are inherently manipulative, that they use their sexuality as a weapon, that men are helpless victims of female charm. This belief system wasn't just about Georgiana, it was about maintaining control over all women by keeping them in a constant state of fear about their own desires and expressions. By publicly rejecting this narrative, he wasn't just defending one woman, he was challenging an entire system of oppression. The trace of that old belief system started cracking right there in that ballroom. And when he said, "I chose," he was taking responsibility in a way men of his era rarely did, admitting that his actions had consequences and he was willing to face them rather than letting someone else suffer in his place. Here's an example that might resonate with you. Imagine a CEO and an entry-level employee have an inappropriate relationship at work. When it comes out, who usually faces the consequences? The person with less power, right? They get fired, blacklisted, their career destroyed, while the CEO might get a slap on the wrist or quietly transferred. Now imagine instead that CEO stands up and says, "This wasn't harassment, this wasn't coercion. I pursued this relationship knowing the risks, and if there are consequences, they should fall on me, not on someone who had far less power in this dynamic." That's essentially what the Duke did, though obviously in a different context. He acknowledged the power imbalance, he took ownership of his role, and he made it clear that any punishment should be directed at him, not at Georgiana. The hidden rules that protected powerful men at the expense of vulnerable women were being exposed and challenged right there in real time. And that word, love, man, that word did heavy lifting in ways you might not immediately recognize. See, scandal is about shame, about something dirty and hidden that needs to be punished. But love? Love is celebrated. Love is pure. Love is what every romance novel and fairy tale is built on. By framing their connection as love rather than lust or scandal or mistake, he elevated it to something society couldn't easily condemn without looking like hypocrites. How could they punish love when they spent all their time arranging marriages and celebrating romantic unions? How could they call it shameful when love was supposed to be the highest aspiration? He essentially trapped them in their own value system, forcing them to either accept his framing or admit that their supposed values were just tools for control rather than genuine beliefs. The mystery of why he'd waited so long to speak dissolved in the face of this perfect, calculated revelation that left no room for continued persecution. The immediate impact in that ballroom was palpable. You could literally feel the shift in energy as people realized they couldn't continue their attack without implicating him. And nobody, absolutely nobody, was going to question a duke of his standing and power. That's the thing about privilege. When it's used selfishly, it perpetuates harm. But when it's used intentionally to protect and uplift others, it can be transformative. Every person who'd whispered cruel things about Georgiana, every matron who'd turned her nose up, every former friend who'd abandoned her, they all suddenly had to reckon with the fact that their judgment had been wrong. Not just wrong, but cruel and baseless. It's like when someone finally validates your pain after everyone's been gaslighting you into thinking you were crazy or overreacting. When someone with authority says, "No, she was right, you were all wrong," it's incredibly liberating and vindicating, especially when you'd started believing the lies yourself. But here's what you really need to understand as we move toward what happened next. Words create the foundation, but actions build the house. Those 8 words were essential. They were powerful. They shifted the entire dynamic in that room. But if the Duke had just said them and walked away, if he hadn't followed through with corresponding actions, they would have eventually been dismissed as a momentary lapse or emotional outburst. The real test of whether those words meant anything, whether they represented genuine change or just performative allyship, would come in what he did immediately after speaking them. Because talk is cheap, even when it comes from powerful people, and especially in a world built on appearances and performances. The conflict between words and actions, between what people say and what they actually do, that's where truth lives. And Georgiana, standing there in shock, was about to discover whether his words would be backed up by actions that matched their revolutionary weight. The Duke didn't stop at those 8 words, and that's what separated genuine commitment from empty gestures. He extended his hand toward Georgiana, right there in front of everyone, palm up, an invitation that carried more weight than any verbal declaration ever could. His hand hung in the air between them. And for Georgiana, reaching out to take it meant accepting not just his support, but also believing she deserved it after weeks of internalizing society's hatred. Her hand trembled as she lifted it. You could see the uncertainty in her movement, the fear that maybe this was some cruel trick, some final humiliation disguised as rescue. But when her fingers touched his palm, and he closed his hand around hers with gentle firmness, something shifted in the atmosphere of that entire ballroom. It wasn't just a gesture of solidarity, it was a public claiming, a statement that said, "She's under my protection now, and anyone who comes for her comes for me too." The secret language of high society had just been rewritten in real time. He pulled her closer, not aggressively, but with clear intention, closing the physical distance between them in a way that left no room for misinterpretation. And then he leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper meant only for her ears, words that nobody else in that massive ballroom could hear, but everyone could see being spoken. "Never lower your head to them again," he said with an intensity that made her spine straighten involuntarily. "You walk beside me now." 4 simple sentences that carried the weight of a revolution, that acknowledged her equality rather than her subservience, that elevated her from victim to partner in one breath. It's like when someone sees you at your lowest, and instead of offering pity, they offer respect and expectation, reminding you of your own strength when you've forgotten it exists. That's what he did with those words. He didn't rescue her like some damsel who needed saving. He reminded her she was powerful enough to stand tall, and now she had backup to ensure nobody could knock her down again. Then came the action that cemented everything, the moment that transformed words into undeniable reality. He led her toward the center of the ballroom, toward the dance floor where everyone could see, where there was no hiding, no ambiguity, no room for society to pretend this wasn't happening. The orchestra, which had been frozen in confused silence, suddenly understood their cue and began playing a waltz. Every eye in that room followed them as they took position, his hand on her waist, hers on his shoulder, their other hands clasped in the traditional dance hold. And they danced. Right there in the center of everything, where all the whispers had happened, where all the judgment had been passed, where Georgiana's character had been torn to shreds just minutes before. They danced like the rest of the world didn't exist. Or more accurately, like the rest of the world's opinions no longer mattered, because he'd decided they didn't. Here's what you got to understand about the symbolism of this moment, because it runs deeper than just a simple dance. In high society, who you danced with mattered enormously. It was a declaration of worthiness, of social standing, of acceptability. By dancing with Georgiana in front of everyone after publicly claiming his love for her, the Duke was forcing society to either accept her or reject him. And nobody was gonna reject him. It's like that saying, actions speak louder than words. But it's even more specific than that. He could have defended her verbally and then kept his distance, maintaining plausible deniability, leaving room for people to dismiss his words as momentary emotion. But by physically claiming her, by touching her publicly, by dancing with her where everyone could see, he made his position undeniable and irreversible. The trace of her former shame was being literally danced away, replaced by this new identity as someone worthy of a duke's public affection and respect. Let me give you a modern parallel that'll make this click. Imagine someone who's been canceled on social media, completely torn apart, their reputation destroyed. Now imagine someone with massive influence and followers not just tweeting, "Hey, leave them alone," but actually bringing that person onto their platform, sitting beside them, sharing space with them publicly, making it clear that attacking that person means going through them first. That's powerful, right? That's the kind of allyship that actually shifts dynamics, rather than just offering thoughts and prayers from a safe distance. The Duke could have sent Georgiana a private letter of apology, could have quietly helped her family financially, could have done 100 things that would have eased his conscience without risking his own reputation. But instead, he chose the most public, most undeniable form of support possible, essentially saying, "My reputation is tied to hers now. We rise or fall together." That's the hidden truth about privilege. It only becomes meaningful when it's risked for others rather than hoarded for self-protection. As they moved across that dance floor, Georgiana's posture began to change. The hunched shoulders started straightening, the downcast eyes began lifting, the trembling in her hands steadied. It's amazing what genuine support can do for someone who's been beaten down, how quickly the human spirit can begin recovering when it's finally given room to breathe again. She wasn't completely healed. That kind of trauma doesn't disappear in a single moment, no matter how dramatic. But she was remembering who she'd been before society tried to destroy her. The conflict between her internalized shame and her inherent worth was starting to resolve in favor of the latter, helped along by his unwavering presence beside her. And the people watching? They couldn't maintain their judgment in the face of such clear, undeniable support from someone they all respected and feared. The conspiracy of silence that had protected their cruelty was being shattered by his willingness to speak truth. Every couple in that ballroom eventually joined them on the dance floor, because to refuse would have been to publicly challenge the Duke, and nobody was brave or foolish enough to do that. So they danced, all of them, in this strange scene where just minutes before they'd been united in condemning Georgiana. And now they were forcing smiles and pretending everything was normal. The hypocrisy was thick enough to choke on, but that's how social change often happens in rigid societies, not through genuine transformation of hearts, but through forced compliance when the power structure demands it. Was it satisfying? Maybe not completely. Would Georgiana have preferred genuine apologies and real remorse? Absolutely. But in a world where power determined reality more than truth did, this forced acceptance was still a victory. It meant she could exist in society again, could hold her head up, could stop carrying the weight of undeserved shame. The mystery of whether people truly changed their minds about her didn't matter as much as the fact that they could no longer act on their judgment without consequences. And here's the deeper lesson embedded in this moment, the one that echoes across centuries and remains relevant today. Redemption rarely comes from proving yourself to people who've already decided you're worthless. It comes from someone with power deciding you're worth defending, someone with privilege choosing to share it, someone with influence using it to rewrite the narrative. Is that fair? Not really. Ideally, we'd all be judged on our own merits without needing powerful advocates. But we don't live in an ideal world. We live in one where privilege and power shape reality. And the question becomes whether those who have it will hoard it or share it. The Duke chose to share it, chose to use his untouchable status to make Georgiana untouchable too, chose to risk social discomfort to correct an injustice he'd helped create through his silence. The revelation wasn't just about love, it was about responsibility, about using your advantages to lift others rather than simply protecting yourself. And as Georgiana spun across that dance floor, she was experiencing firsthand what it felt like when someone finally chose to stand beside her rather than above her or against her. So here we are, at the end of Georgiana's story, but really, we're just at the beginning of yours. Because everything you just heard, every lesson embedded in this tale, every revelation about power and silence and courage, it only matters if you actually do something with it. Let me ask you point blank, how many times have you stayed silent when you should have spoken up? How many times have you watched someone get torn apart and told yourself it wasn't your problem, wasn't your business, wasn't your fight? And here's the harder question, the one that's gonna sting a bit. How many times have you been Georgiana, waiting for someone to defend you? And how many times have you been the Duke in his weeks of silence, protecting yourself while someone else burned? The secret to changing your life, to breaking free from the codes that keep you small and scared and silent, isn't complicated. But it ain't easy either. It requires you to look at the power you do have, even if it feels insignificant compared to others, and ask yourself how you're using it. Are you hoarding it for self-preservation, or are you sharing it to lift others? When someone's being gossiped about, judged unfairly, destroyed by rumors, do you stay quiet to protect your own reputation? Or do you speak truth even when it's uncomfortable? The conflict between self-interest and moral courage is real. I'm not going to pretend it's simple. But every single day, you're making choices about which side of that line you stand on. And those choices, they define who you actually are versus who you think you are. Here's what I want you to do right now, today, this week. Identify one person in your life who's being judged, misunderstood, or treated unfairly. Maybe it's a coworker everyone gossips about. Maybe it's a friend who made a mistake and can't seem to get past it. Maybe it's someone online being torn apart by a mob mentality. Now ask yourself what your 8 words could be. What could you say or do that would shift the narrative, that would use whatever privilege or power you have to protect rather than stay comfortable. You don't need to be a duke with massive social influence. You just need to be willing to stand beside someone when it costs you something. That's where real change happens, not in grand gestures from powerful people, though those help, but in everyday choices from ordinary folks who decide that someone else's dignity matters more than their own social comfort. And let's talk about the times when you're Georgiana, when you're the one being judged and destroyed and waiting for someone to speak up. What's the mystery you need to unravel about your own worth? Why are you letting other people's opinions define your reality? Why are you internalizing shame for things that weren't entirely your fault or weren't wrong at all? The revelation Georgiana had in that ballroom wasn't just that the Duke loved her. It was that she'd forgotten her own value, had let society's judgment become her internal voice. You gotta silence that noise. You gotta remember that the people tearing you down are often the same ones too scared to live authentically themselves. Their judgment says more about their fear than your worth. And the sooner you internalize that truth, the sooner you stop giving them power over your life. Here's my challenge to you, and I want you to take this seriously. Stop waiting for permission to exist fully. Stop apologizing for taking up space. Stop shrinking yourself to make others comfortable. If Georgiana's story taught us anything, it's that redemption doesn't come from proving yourself to people who've already decided you're worthless. It comes from finding your people, the ones who see your value and aren't afraid to say it out loud, and then becoming that person for others. The cycle only breaks when we stop participating in it, when we refuse to join the whisper campaigns, when we use our voices to defend rather than destroy. So what's it gonna be? Are you gonna be part of the problem, another person staying silent while injustice unfolds? Or are you gonna be part of the solution, someone who speaks truth even when it's costly? Think about the hidden power you're carrying right now without even realizing it. Your voice in a meeting could validate someone's idea that everyone else dismissed. Your comment on social media could shift how people perceive someone being attacked. Your willingness to sit with someone everyone else abandoned could remind them they're not lost just because they're alone. These aren't small things. They're everything to the person on the receiving end. The trace you leave in this world isn't measured by your accomplishments or your wealth or your status. It's measured by whether you made it easier or harder for vulnerable people to exist. That's the real test of character. That's what actually matters when everything else falls away. And you're being tested every single day in small moments that feel insignificant but add up to who you become. Now, let me hit you with one final truth that's going to separate the people who just consumed this story from the people who actually transform because of it. Awareness without action is just entertainment. You can understand every lesson in Georgiana's tale. You can nod along to every insight about power and privilege and courage. But if you close this video and go back to your life unchanged, then what was the point? The conflict between knowing better and doing better is where most people get stuck. Comfortable in their understanding but unwilling to risk anything for change. Don't be that person. Be the person who hears a story about courage and becomes braver, who learns about complicity and stops participating in it, who sees injustice and can't stay silent anymore because now you know better and you're gonna do better. So here's what I need from you right now. If this story resonated with you, if it made you think or feel or see something differently, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications because we're just getting started. There are more stories like this, more lessons about power and humanity, and courage buried in history that'll transform how you see the present. This channel is about digging deeper than surface-level content, about finding wisdom in unexpected places, about becoming the kind of person who doesn't just consume information but actually applies it. We're building a community of people who refuse to stay silent, who use whatever power they have to lift others, who understand that real change starts with individual choices compounded across many people. Are you in? Then subscribe, engage, share this with someone who needs to hear it. And let's keep this conversation going, because the world needs more people willing to speak their 8 words when it matters most.